Arguments for the existence of God generally fall into one of the following 5 categories. First, there are the ontological arguments. We could call these the a priori arguments, meaning the arguments that depend on reason alone and do not rely on experience. Anselm is famous for being the origin of ontological arguments. He did it first, although some of his ideas have roots in earlier philosophers, such as Boethius. Anselm, on whom there are videos in the History Philosophy Cartoons playlist on this channel, as well as the Great Text playlist on this channel. Anselm says, well, here's a simple version of his argument. He says, the existence of God must be the case because God is defined as a necessary being, and a necessary being must exist because non-existence is an imperfection. And if we suppose that God does not exist, it follows that a perfect being has an imperfection, which is a contradiction. And this is how Anselm argues for the existence of God. Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz also developed ontological arguments, and nearly everyone agrees that there is something wrong with Anselm's argument and with most of the other ontological arguments. But not everyone thinks that all ontological arguments are bad. In contemporary philosophy, Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga has done some work with the ontological argument and has developed a version of it that he thinks is pretty good. And it doesn't guarantee that God exists because it has this premise that the existence of God is possible. If Plantinga's analysis is correct, the ontological argument shows not directly that God exists, but it shows that the existence of God is either necessary or impossible. So anyone who admits that God is at least possible would have to admit that God is necessary, according to Plantinga's analysis. Second, there are cosmological arguments. Arguments which rely on the notion of cause and effect. Arguments which say that God must exist as the cause of certain effects that we observe in this world. We could call these a posteriori arguments. Arguments relying on experience. Thomas Aquinas gives 3 famous cosmological arguments. See the video in the Great Texts playlist on this channel on Aquinas' 5 ways. These days, the Kalam cosmological argument gets a lot of attention. Roughly, the argument goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause for its beginning. The universe began to exist with the Big Bang. Therefore, there is a cause for the existence of the universe. And this is God. William Lane Craig has done some work with the Kalam cosmological argument, and it is probably the most influential cosmological argument these days, though not the only. Now third, there are teleological arguments, or arguments from the evidence of purpose or design in nature. These are likewise a posteriori arguments, arguments relying on experience. The last argument from Aquinas' 5 ways is a teleological argument. Leibniz made a teleological argument, and in classic British natural theology, William Paley made a teleological argument. Teleological arguments have been attacked by many. David Hume, in his Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, argues that teleological arguments at best fail to show that the God of classical theism exists. They may show that this world was designed, but it could have been done by some lesser god or some other being more powerful and intelligent than we are, but not possessing infinite power or infinite intelligence. Hume also argues that teleological arguments are undermined by the problem of evil, that suffering in nature undermines evidence of design. Also, unsurprisingly, very nearly everyone who accepts the Darwinian thesis, or maybe everyone, thinks that at least some of the arguments from Paley and others need to be rejected, or at least reconsidered. Nevertheless, there are teleological arguments these days that do receive a lot of attention. As a general rule, the intelligent design thesis can be classified as a study of, or as an outgrowth of, teleological arguments. There are analyses of the apparent fine-tuning of this universe for life, for example. These arguments were a big part of the famous former atheist Antony Flew in his becoming a theist, or at least a deist. Flew also received some attention on this channel in both the Tales of the Philosophers playlist and the Topics playlist, in the topic of the presumption of atheism. Fourth, there are the moral arguments. The most famous moral argument is made by C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, in the opening pages of that book, and I recommend reviewing the argument there. In recent days, I understand Andrew Clavin, not a professional philosopher, but maybe something of a philosopher, in his spiritual autobiography, The Great Good Thing, a secular Jew comes to faith in Christ, also makes use of a moral argument. But the notion of a moral argument is very, very old. In Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, cartoon version on this channel, Boethius mentions this great philosopher's line, "Where does evil come from if there is a God? And where does good come from if there isn't?" And even Aquinas' fourth argument from the 5 ways of arguing for the existence of God could almost be construed or revised as a moral argument. The problem with it is that it talks about things besides morality. It talks about beauty and truth and unity, perhaps, but not strictly about goodness. If it were about goodness alone, it would be a moral argument. Maybe we could say it includes a moral argument, although it's also about other things. Now, the general idea with moral arguments is that moral truth is true, and that this truth, or some feature of this truth, cannot be true unless there is a God. The viewer interested in moral arguments is strongly recommended to consult other videos on this channel. One in the Topics playlist on Concepts and Traditions in Ethics, and another on the Great Articles playlist. The video on Elizabeth Anscombe's article, Modern Moral Philosophy. Fifth and finally, arguments for the existence of God are sometimes arguments from religious experience. William Alston, in a recent book, defends the possibility of religious knowledge by experience, and so did Allama Iqbal, a 20th century Islamic philosopher of the Indian subcontinent. And William James wrote a famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, studying this idea. I think we can also classify a certain type of defense of the existence of God or of the truth of a particular Abrahamic religion based on miraculous historical events as an argument from religious experience. Now, if we're talking about historical events, they're not experiences we can personally take up, at least not without a time machine. Understand the difference here between possible arguments from religious experience. An argument from mystical experience, reached through meditation, would be an argument from experiences we could take up. All you have to do is do the meditations, attain the mystical experience. Or don't. Test it for yourself. It's not as easy to test for yourself historical events, at least not without a time machine. But experiences in history are still experiences. And an argument based on them is an argument from experience. And if the historical evidence is pretty good, then since I can know, for example, that Socrates died in Athens after drinking hemlock, I know this from history, it's at least possible to know that these miraculous events occurred in history. And so certain arguments for the truth of a particular religion or for the existence of God based on historical events, I think, should be classified as arguments for God based on religious experience. Some arguments made by Augustine and Aquinas would seem to fit in this category.